This is a story about the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we live out in the world, and the space between those two. It's about how we love, how we lose, and how we recover, or not, through the stories we make up in our heads. I'm Robin Rice, and this is also my story. Chapter 24. His Holiness in India. Travel changes us, or at least it should. To see others living out a different story from our own, in ways astonishingly foreign to us, is to grow. Lately, there's been a lot of buzz about privilege, who has it and who does not. If we have the means to travel, we have privilege. The least we can do is use it well. Where you choose to travel, and when and with whom, sets the stage. From there, you've got another host of choices. You can stick to the guidebooks and travel will be mostly a same old, much like a genre romance or stock mystery of 65,000 words. Pretty much the same story every time. I should know, I studied romance writing at the start of my career because a best-selling romance writer was the only mentor I could find. I got good enough to tell you on exactly what page the hero was meant to show up and just how far you could go with the obligatory sex scene. But you will never read the 2 books I wrote for practice. I'll spare you that. Alternatively, when you travel, you can surprise yourself by taking Walden's road less traveled, heading down the dirt side streets to the small grungy restaurant packed with locals that turns out to have surprisingly good food. Taking this route, you are bound to become confused, uncertain of what is what and where is where and who is who. You may not know who to trust. You might misjudge when to arrive at an event because the timing is so customary no one thinks to tell you that 6 p.m. really meant 4 or 8. You may not understand critical cultural differences, like when to never use your right hand to give money to someone. To journey out of your comfort zone makes you a traveler, not a tourist. It makes you someone willing to take these risks, sometimes risking your life. Even more, it proves that you are someone willing to change your opinions, long-held beliefs, even some of your values, the ones that didn't hold much merit to begin with. Some of these changes will be voluntary. Others will hit you like a truck you didn't see in its rearview mirror while backing up. It's no one's fault, but there you are, lying on the ground. Everyone hopes you'll make it, but by that time, it doesn't do you a lot of good. Stories born in other places break our story rules of life, and mostly we don't like that. We may scream into the Spanish countryside, "Why doesn't anyone speak English?" and realize we are exactly that ugly American who is living up to our country's royally crappy reputation. Don't ask me how I know. You disappoint yourself in your obvious small-mindedness, thinking you'd be different, but you are not. You may risk your late teenage life to travel by Italian gondola to a Venetian apartment with a young man dressed in all white, bright white cotton next to olive skin, my God. But I've told you that story already. Still, it makes me sigh even now, 40-plus years later. So, brilliantly traveled, Robin, if I do say so myself. I have come to believe you cannot call yourself a true storyteller without traveling, at minimum to a place that lives beyond your personal ideas. To know a thing well enough to write about it, you must know its opposite, or at least its other. To know good, you must know evil. To know grace, you must know the feeling of being utterly forlorn, forsaken to yourself and all else. To know love, you must have in some way been unloved. It was for this reason that I took my newly emerging spiritual education beyond the books on my nightstand and set out for India. The quest was both easier than I might have imagined at the start and more difficult than I could have believed by the finish. Thankfully, Terry went with me. I'm convinced I would never have lived to tell the tale without her. But before we go there, we have to back up. let's set this traveler's stage. Enter the labyrinth. The first time I saw the Dalai Lama was with Sue the shaman. We traveled by train to New York where he was speaking. You must understand, at this point, almost no one knew who he was. At least, no one I knew besides Sue. She was the one who told me about my connection to the high Himalayas and the Tibetans. She was the one who nodded thoughtfully when I told her about reading his book and my strange response. She was the one who gave me a look of, I understand, when I shared remembering being a monk in my past life regression. He was speaking to a crowd of perhaps 600, which seemed large at the time. Today, 6,000 would be small and 60,000 more like it. Inexplicably to either of us, Sue and I were ushered to the very front of the church and seated only 3 rows from where His Holiness sat. At that point, I still had no idea just how unlikely it would be for someone like me to be spending time so close to him. To be honest, I wasn't overly impressed at first. I mean, he was interesting. Half the time, really the entire time it was not his turn to speak, he was looking around the church in wonder, seemingly not paying the least bit of attention to what anyone else was saying. He seemed innocent, like a child of 4 or 5 years old. But I didn't want to be rude, and so I kept my thoughts to myself. But did we really come all the way to New York for this guy? Sue seemed enchanted, so I didn't dare lean over and say, "What's the fuss?" Still, after an hour of listening to him and everyone else, I didn't feel anything. And then it was over, and we stood up, and I almost fell over, backward. I had to catch the back of the pew with my arm to prevent it. My legs were wobbly, my breathing slowed, and my heart raced. I was not impressed. I was, I don't know, imprinted in some way? Who was this man? Now I really had to find out. Soon after, I had a wild hair idea. It came to me in a journey which at the time I trusted far too completely. A movie idea. I would take a small group of wayward teenagers who had never left their own country, the United States, to meet him at his home in exile. We would interview them before and after the trip to Dharamsala to see if he had the same powerful effect on them that he had had on me. Astonishingly, I was given permission to present the film idea to his head of staff in a meeting within the Dalai Lama's inner sanctuary, his literal home. I was no one to be granted such permission, no one to even think of making a film, in India no less. But, as I have said, I was in the early days of having visions, and I'd seen it, so that was enough for me. And, oddly, enough for the senior leaders of his spiritual community, too. Go figure. While I waited for the trip's schedule of meetings to solidify, I was invited to a more private event with His Holiness in my own town of Washington, D.C. There were 300 at best there this time. I took a friend, Mark, who had never heard of him but felt intrigued. Once again, I was taken to a prime seat without anyone knowing I was the girl creating the film. I thought it was a sign, but of what? His Holiness and nearly 24 of his entourage of monks made a stunning procession from the back of the event hall to the front, sweeping right past me on the right-hand side of the right aisle where I was sitting. They came so close I could have reached out and touched one of their gold and red robes. Tempting, but no, I didn't. The feeling as they passed almost made me weep. This time, I did not only feel His Holiness, but the weight of, what would you call it? Beauty, majesty, of the entirety of them. A community, a tradition. I could not explain it. For all the foreign differences, they felt familiar to me. Again, I felt the powerful draw to this world, their world, as if, as I had remembered in my past life regression, these were my people. I let the feeling envelop me, noting to myself how hard the feeling of home had been to come by in my current life. Yes, that was it. I felt homesick for something I'd never known in this life. I looked at them all, astonished, thrilled, baffled. Who was I to feel I knew these people? Yet somehow, from somewhere, they were family. If there was any doubt that past lives were real in some form, this feeling was my strongest argument for the idea. I wondered if they would make their procession back up the aisle to the left, giving everyone else the swish-by I had gotten. But no, they made their way back up the right. Not only that, His Holiness was stopping to bow, hands together, and touching foreheads with everyone sitting on the aisle as he made his way up. It was an unexpected blessing, and, sitting on the aisle myself, it was coming directly to me. The gravity of the situation overcame me. Soon, assuming he kept it up, I would be touching heads with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Who gets that? What white woman from the Midwest of America ever gets that? That's not how it went, though. I wasn't disappointed so much as shocked. His Holiness did come to me, but he did not bow or touch my head. Instead, with me bowed, he struck me hard 3 times, nearly knocking me over. Let me tell you, that man is strong. And then, taking no more time than if we had touched heads, he went along his way up the aisle, bowing and touching heads with every other person along the way. No one else was struck once, let alone 3 times. What? I hadn't dared meet his gaze, so I had no idea of his intention. I wondered if he somehow knew how bad I'd been. But it didn't feel like that. It felt encouraging. When he got far enough away, I turned to Mark to ask, what was that? He shrugged and asked how it felt. I said, sort of like a you go girl? Mark laughed and agreed. That was pretty much his expression. You go girl. What the? If I was not sure before, I now knew I had to go to India to his government in exile and try to make this film about him. I had no money, no experience, and no team, unless you counted Terry. But every door opened. Even Terry's connections came through, having college friends who had become Irish ambassadors that were serving at the embassy of New Delhi. We bought tickets, made appointments, were assigned a host at the government in exile in Dharamsala, and off we went, like this was normal. Like our lives were not about to change. Except they were. At least mine. I could write an entire book about the next 10 days of my life. I could tell you how, traveling east, you lose a calendar day, in my case Monday, which is a very odd sensation, as if you are leaving the rest of your life and world behind and living perpetually out of step with time. I could tell you about seeing heaps of filth on every street corner, with cows and children eating out of the same pitiful piles. I could tell you how the trains have holes in the bathroom floor leading directly to the tracks below, that you are to attempt to relieve yourself despite the train's constant rickety swaying, how Terry refused to drink water whenever we took a train to avoid just that, and how I wasn't so smart. I could tell you how the elderly and sick laid down to die on the train station floor and how we learned to simply step over them, though not without great inner angst, I assure you. I could tell you about the padlock, as large as a car door, on the gate outside Terry's friend's embassy house, and the 24/7 guards stationed at it. I could tell you about eating the most amazing mangoes of my life, still the best food I have ever tasted anywhere. I could tell you about meeting an Indian palm reader who told me I'd always have as much money as I spent, just before he cheated me out of $800 worth of jewelry and rugs, which he promised to deliver to my hotel before we moved to another part of the country. The jewelry and rugs did come, but they were not the ones I had spent hours carefully selecting. I have a mismatch of rubies and a cheaper rug to show for it. I could tell you about being held at machine gun gunpoint, No joke, as our taxi driver was extorted by 2 rogue bandits. They flanked the road on either side and held up only a single rope to stop our taxi, but that was enough. Automatic weapons slung over shoulders are very convincing. Terry and I wisely kept our mouths shut, a first for me, until when, what seemed like an hour later, they worked something out with our driver and let us pass. I could tell you about the luxury of ordering tea and toast in the room where Richard Gere was known to have slept whenever he was in Dharamsala, and how I liked to joke among girlfriends that I had indeed slept in Richard Gere's bed. I could tell you of the woman with a baby on her hip who watched me spend a crazy amount of money on souvenirs, typical American shopping, and how she followed me day after day, making eye contact, waiting for me to share some of that easy money with her. I did, of course, and as I had feared, a moment later dozens of women showed up with hands outstretched, more babies on more hips. Yet none of these things made this the trip that changed my life. I cannot tell you what it did to me to see children, some only a few years old, maimed and blinded in order to be more sympathetic beggars. Our driver informed us that these were not accidents, but the results of those who would, at the end of the day, take all the money these babies collected. We were instructed to do the exact opposite of what I was inclined to do, what I had the heart to do, which was to relieve this incredible suffering. We were instructed not to make eye contact, and definitely not to roll down the window despite the sweltering heat, lest a dirty little hand would, with no hesitation, reach in to beg with all the more urgency. Not a few children either. Hundreds, each belonging to their own street corners. Old women, too, very old, and men with no legs, no arms, or both. I followed the rules, being out of my depth and with limited understanding, let alone wisdom, but my body revolted. My neck froze in place, unable to be moved to the left or the right. If I was not willing to look, it seemed intent on rendering me unable to. A local Indian body worker made house calls, thankfully, and after many days I began to loosen up. My gut never stopped churning, though, and my heart felt like stone. We moved from New Delhi to Dharamsala, but the damage was done. I had not realized it before, but I had within me a wildly naive and hubristic vision that somehow, with my gifts and awakening, if I could just figure out how to use them, I might change the world. After seeing the intentionally maimed and blinded, I knew with a profound, devastating certainty that I would not and could not. The world was so much bigger than I had ever imagined, with more troubles on more street corners than I could have fathomed. Yet a thought emerged alongside this realization. Who was I to potentially have a gift and not use it? I'd felt embarrassed every time David Davis had said I could heal just by thinking. But what if I could? I mean, what if I could? What if there was even a 0.0001% chance? What if I could do something instead of nothing? What if I could take one street corner, whichever one I found myself to be on at any given moment, and do my best with it? Who was I to hold back if healing another was even remotely possible? I didn't want to be a healer, but I decided to try, to heal, just by thinking. Still deeply embarrassed at the idea, I chose to test out my skills on Terry, without telling her, of course. She wouldn't mind, I was sure. I would see if anything I thought worked, and if not, we'd be done with it. As it happened, she was feeling ill that next morning, yet she did not want to miss our meeting with the Tibetan Women's Association. She went in dragging, but she went in. Soon enough, we were sitting at the meeting drinking yak butter tea, a drink I found so pungently horrific I could barely drink it. But we dutifully drank anyway. Terry looked as miserable as I was about it, but it might have been because she wasn't feeling well. I began to send healing energy toward her with my mind. I had no idea what I was meant to do or how it worked. Not how much energy to send or what else I should be thinking of. I decided to send and to keep sending her the thought, you are well, you are energetic, you are happy. I pushed the energy toward her in the same way David Davis once sent me energy balls. After our meeting, I didn't have to ask how she was feeling. She was nearly leaping with a boundless energy. Can you believe that yak tea? She bubbled over. Very rare for Terry. It was amazing. I feel amazing. I smiled and shyly told her what I had been up to. It could have been the tea, but I had a feeling it wasn't. It had done nothing for me. I didn't heal any maimed arms or blind eyes, but that moment with Terry was enough of a start to encourage me. That and the realization that I had a responsibility to develop my gifts, however small, in whatever ways I could. Despite entering into the inner sanctum of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's government in exile, Terry and I had to go through a metal detector before being admitted. It seemed oddly out of place, yet wise, and also sad to be needed. And despite being given official approval from his second-in-command, again, I thought they were crazy not seeing right through me, the film was never made. Though I tried, the money didn't arrive before pretty much everyone in the world suddenly knew the name of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which meant the premise of the film dissolved. Today, I believe that making a film was not what that trip was about. Many films with His Holiness have been made since and by much more equipped filmmakers than me. Yes, I was meant to go, but not for a project. This was about my education in the real state of the world. It was about the ripping away of any innocence, ignorance, arrogance, and hubris that I had about my own awakening and what it might mean. I learned that there was nothing romantic about a government in exile. I learned that there is nothing heroic about my early life suffering as compared to the countless young boys and girls crossing the Himalayas on foot in winter at the risk of their own lives just to be safe from a militant Chinese government. Terry and I met them at the orphanage there. My own self-pity washed away like dirt in a shower. I learned that my prayers were and always had been small and all about me. And if there was no God to save the peace-loving Buddhists from terror and torture, there wasn't going to be one to save me from my petty, privileged fears either. Another nail in the God coffin. Not that I needed one. Life on earth was, as the Buddhists taught, suffering. I wasn't special in that regard, no matter how many of my loved ones had died. Not at all. I also learned that my corner of the world was mine. I'm not Tibetan, and I'm not a Buddhist. I have no spiritual family to call my own. Even so, I was fortunate to turn the gigantic prayer wheels outside the home of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, to see with my own eyes the stunning Himalayas, to meet monks and nuns who were giving their lives to become more compassionate, and to be served awful yak tea by a group of women whose lives and families and friendships had been torn apart by senseless greed and power-hungry leaders. I was fortunate to be struck by His Holiness the Dalai Lama 3 times. In India, I learned that was not meaningless, but a gesture that was offered as a special blessing, one to take away negative karma from someone so they could do good for the people. I was honored, and it left me with an even greater sense of responsibility. Maybe I would not make a film, but I could and would do something. I was blessed to learn that I might be able to heal in some small way, and was left with a feeling that if there was any such thing as a sin, it was in not using the gifts we were given. Traveling back to the U.S., I was sicker than I have ever been in my life. So much so they almost didn't let me on the plane, and after the first leg, they put me in an infirmary in Amsterdam. I was barely able to stand, vomiting blood, and unable to stop defecating myself. It was a fitting end to the trip of a lifetime, the one that for a brief period of time stole a Monday and all my innocence along with it. My Monday returned because time across time zones is like that. But I was never the same. Whatever sleeping giant might be within me, it could not be only in me. It had to be within us all. We would all have to awaken to the devastation our humanity was creating in this world if we wanted anything to change. Maybe I was different because of my awakening, but I wasn't alone as a human. And now I knew nothing is changed by one person. I could and would use whatever gifts I had, but I would also make it part of my mission to encourage everyone else to do the same. Enter your labyrinth at BeWhoYouAre.com.